Hello and welcome to today's event titled Proactive Compliance, Investing Now to Keep Federal Funds Flowing. This is Robert Atmore, Senior Fellow at the Governing Institute. I'm excited to serve as moderator for today's event and just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next 60 minutes. Before we begin, I'll cover a couple brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass along to colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box on the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send your questions as they come up throughout the presentation. Our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of our webinar today. If you would like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking on the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Please use #GovLive to connect with your peers across the governing platform via Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would like to complete the survey as much as you're able, please click the red survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you are experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. Okay, let's begin with some brief introductory information. Next slide.
So Bob, would you like me to introduce myself?
There we go. I was having a bit of technical difficulty, but I just advanced it. So here we go.
All right.
This session will be all about the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act of 2014. Many of you probably already know that President Obama signed this into law in May of 2014. It's intended to make federal spending data more accessible, searchable, and reliable, thereby addressing concerns about data reliability of prior efforts in this area. It requires setting data standards that improve the quality of federal spending data reported, and it requires that it create a standard data exchange to codify the data in standard computer-readable formats. The two lead agencies for this effort at the federal level are the Office of Management and Budget and the U.S. Treasury Department. They've been working on developing standardized definitions, and in August of 2015, they issued definitions for 57 standardized data elements to help ensure consistent and comparable information being reported. Those are available online at the web at the URL listed in this particular slide, and they encourage folks to take a look at those. They will continue to solicit feedback and comments as they go forward with this project. This is very much a work in process. It's in the implementation phase at the federal level right now, with federal agencies going through various pilots. By May of 2017, all federal agencies are to provide data for posting on usaspending.gov using the standard data exchange called the Data Act schema. There are a number of pilot projects called for in the Data Act legislation, including one that I've highlighted on this particular slide, the Section 5 pilot, which is to develop recommendations for the use of common reporting elements, the elimination of unnecessary duplication in financial reporting, and the reduction of compliance costs for recipients. I know from speaking with colleagues that there is some skepticism regarding how successful that effort may be, eliminating duplicate financial reporting, but it's something that's very much desired in the recipient community, and also reducing compliance costs since there is little, if any, incremental funding available to implement this particular act. Also included in the legislation are calls for implementation reviews and audits. So there's a series of reviews and audits by the Government Accountability Office and the Federal Inspectors General, which are intended to address data quality concerns and hold federal agencies more accountable for the information they disclose on usaspending.gov. The GAO has issued a report back in April of this year indicating that progress has been made, but noting that there are significant challenges that need to be addressed for effective Data Act implementation. So, as I said, this is very much a work in process. There's a good deal going on currently, and we'll see how that all plays out going forward. So, joining me today for this presentation of this timely topic is Sherry Amos, Director of Government Industry Marketing for Workday. It's my pleasure to introduce Sherry, who brings over 20 years of experience to her role leading industry strategy for the education and government industries for Workday. She's responsible for working with customers, partners, and industry trend influencers to bring high-value, next-generation cloud solutions to market. Prior to joining Workday, she led industry strategy teams for SAP for all regulated industries, including state and local government, education, federal government, utilities, and healthcare. Sherry has also previously held executive positions with Oracle and PeopleSoft in strategy, product management, and marketing roles. As our feature speaker for today, Sherry will focus on the impact of the Data Act on financial management systems. She'll offer ideas on what state and local recipients of federal funds should be doing to prepare for the new Data Act requirements. With that brief intro, I'm going to pass it to you, Sherry. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So a few of the topics that I'm going to touch on here in my remarks really are around some assumptions. We are making some assumptions at this stage. As Bob said, this legislation was passed. It is currently in process of being implemented across federal agencies first. We're going to talk a little bit about just a bit more of the background about where some of this came from, the technologies they have in place at the federal level. What really is new versus what you may be doing today in your federal reporting for grants and contracts. Give a little bit of an overview of this new data schema and what's referred to as data packages, really from a business perspective, not so much from a technical perspective, although there is technical data available. And really, we wanted to take the approach today of, depending upon what kind of financial system you have in place today, there can be different types of implications of how you may think about preparing yourself to meet these new requirements. There have been quite a lot of conference sessions, I know, on this topic, but very few of them have really taken that perspective, and we thought we could bring that kind of a view. What are some of the limitations and considerations, and what are some of the things to think about as you go forward preparing for this? But first, some of the assumptions that we make. This is a serious topic, but, it always helps to bring a little humor to the program. So today we're going to make the assumption that there'll be no crying about unfunded federal mandates. So I know we've had a lot of those. Reporting, as Bob said, does begin for federal agencies in May of 2017. Now, that does not, at that point in time, include new reporting requirements for recipients of federal money. But what will occur from that point forward are the pilot projects that Bob mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more of those. They are due to report back to Congress on the success or the issues or the challenges by August of 2017. So I think, that will certainly be a milestone for recipients, is to keep track of what's happening in the pilot projects and keep track of what's happening in that report, because it will be after that point in time that they solidify whatever new requirements are going to be required of recipients of federal money. And just a little bit of background about some of this obviously was born out of prior legislation for the Federal Financial Accountability and Transparency Act, which has been around for a while. A lot of this actually came out of the legislation from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or what was known as the Stimulus Act. And it was at that point that the federal government invested quite a bit in technology for building out the public transparency websites that many of you had to report into, and for making the data more available to the public through the Recovery Act website. Now, all of those assets that the federal government invested in have now been transferred over to this initiative. So you're probably going to see some similarities in what you may have seen for the Stimulus Act. And there was another part of the technology that was put in place that people don't talk about too much, but it's a very important goal of the federal government. There was a lot of technology put in place and processes and programs also that were engineered to prevent fraud and fraudulent transactions. So that is in the background of what's going on here as well. And so just before we jump into too much more meat, we wanted to take just a quick poll, a quick question. So, Bob, I'll kick it back to you just to introduce the poll question and give people a few minutes to respond.
That sounds great, Sherry. Okay, so our first poll question should be on your screen. Did you implement a reporting solution for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act? Simple yes or no question, so we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that if you would, and then we're going to share the results with you on our very next slide. So if you can just take a second, respond whether or not you did that, and we'll take a look and see what our results look like. Okay, 47% yes, 52% no. One more question for you, if you would. If yes, did you, 1, purchase a solution, 2, build a custom solution, 3, implement a data warehouse strategy, or 4, something other than that? So if you answered yes to the prior question, if you would please just click on one of those, and we will share those results momentarily also. Okay. Nobody purchased a solution. Almost 44% built a custom solution, 25% implemented a data warehouse strategy, and 31%, other. All right, Sherry, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I think that's interesting, and it does show really the difficulty of the landscape out there across different types of organizations of dealing with some of these particular reporting challenges. So let's dive into what some of those are. Bob mentioned that 57 data elements have been standardized at the federal level for federal agencies to begin reporting to those 57 standardized data elements. But there are many more data elements out there, depending upon the type of federal program, that have to be considered. And so what they've done is they call these data requirements packages, package A, B, C, D, and E. That language may change a bit, but particularly around the federal level, package A, B, and C is specific to federal agencies, and package D and E are specific to recipients. So they break down into award information in package D and recipient information in package E. And this applies to grants, loans, and or contracts. And as Bob mentioned before, part of the challenge at the federal level is there's really been not a lot of standardization, and that's what they're trying to address with some of this effort. The federal government gives out about $550 billion in grants and approximately $300 billion in contracts. And if you think about that, that's really millions and millions of transactions, awards, data that has to be tracked. So they've broken these packages down at that level. So what does that mean for you and your financial and subsystems? Well, depending upon the type of money that you receive, it could mean that you have disparate systems. For instance, a statewide government often has disparate systems across many of the agencies. You may have a statewide ERP or finance system. Your procurement system may be different. Your grant systems may be different. So the first start really is to take a look at your system landscape and to map where the data sits. Because you're going to need information from financial systems, procurement systems, and grant systems, ultimately, to meet these requirements. And as a recipient, and I am sort of taking more of the recipient view here today than the federal view, but as a recipient, there are going to be new data elements and attributes that are going to be required ultimately as a part of this. They already have issued some new ones in a part of their standard packages. But I think the thing that people tend to forget about, even if you are reporting on some of the existing data elements today, in this effort to standardize data elements, you may have one award character that's a 5-digit length field, and the standardization may now say it's going to be an 8-digit length field. So as you're thinking through your strategy and how to begin thinking about this or looking at this, some of those are the kinds of things that we need to keep in mind. So when we thought about what kind of systems really are out in the government landscape today, really there are three fundamental types of systems from my perspective, given my background in the industry and some of the places that I've been. And so we're going to take a look at each of those different types of systems and try to give you some things to think about, what might be some of the things that you need to think through, what might be some of the challenges, what might be, maybe you'll have an easy time, for instance, if you have a standardized system across all of your organizations or agencies, than you will if you have disparate systems. So the first type system, really, there's still a lot of mainframe or custom-built systems out in the government marketplace. And so that's the first kind of system we're going to talk about. Some of those older first-generation financial ERP-type systems, or even some of those that were custom-built. There are still a fair amount of those out in government. And then we're going to talk about what are sort of the packaged applications, that wave of implementation that came about really responding to the Y2K issues. Many organizations implemented packaged applications from that era. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the most modern solutions, which are solutions that have been built very recently. Modern cloud-based solutions have a different architecture. And then many of those core systems still have a lot of best-of-breed systems around them.
and feeding data in and out of them. So the first type of system, we'll call that the Flintstone era. These were the old mainframe custom systems out there. And part of the challenge with dealing with anything like this new reporting requirement are that many of those were built around a design and an architecture of a fixed length rigorous account code structure. So all of the logic of the reporting of the accounting was built directly into the account code structure. Much of the reporting of those systems was custom coded, again, around that fixed length rigorous account code structure, and change requires a lot of costly custom coding. And so when you think about the data elements that may be new that you don't even have in your system today, if you have that type of system, that's going to be an important area to think through, to map out how you're going to collect that data, how you're going to map that data to what you do have in your system. Also, do you have another way to add additional logic in your system without changing your chart of accounts structure? Because I think if we have a lot of financial people on the call today, certainly everyone understands how difficult it is to change a chart of accounts structure from top to bottom. And hopefully that will not be required. But again, it's something that can be a challenge, something that you have to think through. And you have a little over a year, probably maybe a little longer, to start thinking through some of that. Again, the reporting is all custom coded typically. So take a look at all of the reports that you generate to the federal government today, whether it's to a specific agency or it's for a specific contract or an award. So that's another place we'll want to think about starting to look at the reports you produce today, how you do that, because this is really going to be the toughest type of system to bring into this modern era and deal with some of what's going to come over the next year to 2 years. And I failed to mention that these requirements are typically, as it stands today, are going to be required of any organization that receives over $25,000 in federal money. So if you receive less than that, maybe you don't have a particular issue, but most government organizations certainly receive more than that. So mainframe custom systems going to be a particular challenge, may be fairly costly to implement this in those type of systems, and another good reason to start thinking about it now and getting your plan together for how that will be addressed now. The next type of system really that came about were the packaged applications, again, that many organizations implemented to deal with Y2K issues or hybrid issues. And fundamental characteristics of those systems were that they were relational database solutions. So the intent of relational databases was actually to make reporting easier. That was one of the intents of that design. These systems also introduced the concepts of what were called attribute-based reporting data elements, which were additional ways to add information about accounts. Usually they were held at the account level, not the transaction level. But you could add, for instance, grant attributes to a particular general ledger account, and it gave you a multi-dimensional way of tracking the data. And so that was a more flexible system for adding things like what we're talking about with the Data Act. But again, you ultimately do run into limitations on how many attributes you have for use, or as they define these standardized definitions and standardized lengths of fields or standardized mapping relationships to the federal elements, that could still be a challenge. But also with those kind of systems, generally came more flexible report writers. So you had multidimensional report writers. You could still do ad hoc reporting. You could still do custom reporting if you wanted to. But again, there are limitations on attribute changes at certain levels of data in these systems. And most of the time, those elements were carried, at the account level. They weren't really carried at the transactional level. This is also the era where a lot of people started implementing data warehouses for a lot of reasons, but one of which was because they could never get the same data in one place, whether it was for internal reporting or external constituent reporting or even compliance reporting. And so data warehouses became sort of a wave of that era as well. And certainly there are many of those still in use today. Part of the challenges, again, were the auditability and the traceability of the data from a source system back to a transactional level. So still introduced some challenges. And so if you have this type of system in your landscape today, hopefully you will have more flexibility and options when you're thinking about implementing this new Data Act as it comes down the road. So that was the second type of system that tends to be out in the marketplace. The third type of system is what we do at Workday. And because these are the most modern designed type of systems, the approach that was taken here is that data is quote-unquote unified. And some of these old systems, you have a different data model for payroll information, for instance. You have a different data model for financial information. You have a different data model for procurement or grants or payment information. And when we say the data is unified, it's all unified in one data model. So what this allows modern systems to do is to use this concept that we call transaction tagging. And so when you use tags at the transaction level, that gives you the ultimate ability for data traceability and data auditability all the way up from summarized account all the way back down to any individual transaction that impacted that summarized account. So this new concept of tagging actually can be applied to any transaction in the system. So it's quite flexible and really is adaptable to changes such as the Data Act. It also can eliminate or work with existing data marts and warehouses. So this kind of a tagging concept is one of the components that the Data Act at the federal level is going to look to require. They are looking today at requiring the use of what's called XBRL, Extensible Business Reporting Language. And if you aren't familiar with that, if you think about public companies and how they report their data to the SEC, they do that through a technology called XBRL. And so XBRL is a mapping technology where you lay out the taxonomy of what kind of report has to be submitted, and then you map your system data to that taxonomy. And then that is a technical tool that actually is used to submit the data into the receiving system. And the federal government is very interested in the use of XBRL as a part of the Data Act requirements as they go forward. So you may have a new technology to think about, an investment that you need to think about in a new technology. And so we don't know exactly where that stands today. They're certainly talking about requiring that. But that probably won't be reasonable that all recipients would be able to do that on day one. So I'm sure they'll offer other methods of submitting the data, but also they'll encourage people to get to this automated particular case as soon as possible. So I think here, Bob, we have another poll question for the audience, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Very good. We do, and the question for the audience is, are you a participant in the recipient pilot project being led by the Department of Health and Human Services currently? So there's a pilot project that HHS has taken the lead on. They've encouraged folks to voluntarily participate. Our question is, for you folks on the line, are you a participant? And the results are 3%, yes. So the majority of our participants are not. Majority of our participants are not participants in that pilot.
Okay, very good, very telling. Thank you, Bob. Let's go back for just a minute and talk about the pilot projects here. So there are actually two pilot projects being led at the federal level, and one is called the Federal Procurement Track Pilot, and that really is focused on the contractor community. So contractors and subcontractors that are competing for federal awards. And that effort is being led by the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Chief Acquisition Officer Council. And I think even though they call that a pilot project at the moment, they're really only at a discussion stage. So the Chief Acquisition Officer Council is asking for input from the public, and I would encourage you, if you are a contractor, to go out to that site and offer your input. But the other, probably more important one for this audience is the pilot that's being led by the Department of Health and Human Services, and that was a part of the legislation that HHS lead this pilot. And so really, that's the largest one. And if you go out to the HHS site for the Data Act pilot project, you'll see where they are today. Now, they have developed what's called a Common Data Element Repository Library, or the C-DER library, for financial assistance data. And what they've done is they've taken all of the data elements, there are about 112 of them, across the federal government that have been authorized by various sources to be collected, and they've put them in this CEDAR library, so you can access all of those. You can see what all of those are. And this will be the foundation of how they go about really determining how to standardize those elements for use across the federal government and for recipients. So good for you, those of you that are participating in that pilot project, and for the 97.5% that are not, I encourage you to go take a look at the Department of Health and Human Services site and really sort of dig into the content that they have there, because I think that can be really helpful in determining your path forward. So now let's go to talk just a little bit about what can you be doing, what should you be thinking about doing at this particular point in time, given that there's no really set of compliance issues that have been delivered to recipients. Well, the first thing is certainly start to get your strategy defined. Do you have a centralized strategy? Do you have a decentralized strategy? And again, for those of you that did implement Recovery Act solutions, a lot of people at that time also implemented their own public transparency initiatives. So perhaps you have someone in your organization that thinks about this kind of stuff all the time. If so, great. If not, I would suggest that you might establish a little bit of a strategy committee across those that receive the federal money in your organization, as well as your IT organization, since there will be impacts on both sides. So you can start thinking about your organization, your strategy. Generally, what do you want your strategy to be? Is it a centralized or decentralized strategy? Will each agency be taking care of their own reporting? So that would be the first thing. Get your strategy in order for the coming 12 to 24 months. And the next item is really, where is your data? And as we talked about, you may have a lot of data in a centralized ERP-type system. You may not. You may have decentralized ERP systems, particularly if you are a state and multiple agencies are running their own systems. So do a system map of where the data sits. How many systems? Where are they? Who owns them? What kind of data? And so have a system map as a part of your strategy. And the next suggestion is also now do an inventory map of the data elements that you have sitting in your system, and particularly with those 112 data elements that are sitting out on the Health and Human Services site. Those are primarily the data elements that are expected of recipients today, and even though they may change as part of this project, it's still a good place to start to map the data that you have to the likely data that will be required, and to the level of detail that may be required. There are a number of new elements that are being introduced. There are new elements around the period of time of the performance, the place of the performance. There are new data elements requiring that the top highly compensated executives within an organization, that will also be a part of the reporting for organizations that don't otherwise report that publicly. So you can start to discern where some of these new items might impact you and how you'll need to collect them or think about reporting for them. The next is to think about reporting modifications. So all of the types of reports that you send to a particular agency at the federal government, for instance, that is a part of this effort of the Data Act. They are trying to look across all of those different reports, and it is a goal for them to try to minimize the number of reports as this project goes forward. Some people have offered the concept that they really should just require one federal financial report and then every agency use it for their own purposes. Not quite sure if we're going to get that far, but those are some of the suggestions that are going into these pilot projects to think about. Because as Bob said earlier, one of the goals of this effort is not only to standardize the reporting at the federal level to make it more transparent to the public, to prevent fraud, as we talked just a little bit about earlier, but it is a goal to reduce the cost of compliance on recipients. Now, that to me means overtime, but as I see some of the things that are going on now, it probably doesn't mean that immediately for those of you that receive federal money. There probably is going to be some level of investment required for you to get your systems to a point where you'll be able to accommodate these new reporting requirements. And those are the next 3 points here. Can you do this internally with no external consulting help? Do you think you'll need external consulting help? Will you need new technologies and tools? For instance, will you need XBRL tools? Should you start looking at those now? Will you need to ask for additional IT investments in order to support what's going to be required? And I think we had some percentage of you that responded to the poll that you do have a data warehouse or a permanent data store. Probably going to require some changes there. And for those of you that don't have a permanent data store for these types of compliance requirements that are coming down, you may want to think about that. So I think while the long-term goal is to reduce the cost of compliance and the burden on recipients, that probably won't be the initial impact. So those were some of the ideas we wanted to give you to start thinking about as you formulate your strategy and be well prepared for this. We do encourage you to keep track of what's going on in these pilot projects. Do encourage you to be an active voice in the pilot projects and give your feedback, even if you can't participate formally. They all have ways that you can give your feedback or ask your questions about where they are in this process at the moment. So I think with that, that's the end of my prepared remarks and thoughts, Bob, but I know we wanted to open it up and leave a fair amount of time for questions from the audience.
Very good. If I could, I would just like to echo your encouragement for folks to pay attention, keep an eye on what's going on with these pilots, and share your thoughts, because it's a question of time, not if, we're going to be dealing with new requirements to report under the Data Act. So it's important to get involved as early as possible in doing this. I guess we're getting relatively close to the end of our time today, so we should probably jump right into some questions from the audience. Many of you have been asking about getting copies of today's presentation. Within the next 48 hours, Governing will provide all attendees with a link to the recording for your reference or to share with colleagues. So let's go ahead and go to our first questions from the audience. Well, we've got a couple questions that deal with timing, so I'll pick one here. What is the expected time frame for beginning state reporting of subrecipient grants on the Data Act? You want to take a shot at that one, Terry?
Sure. So right now they have not set a date for when recipients will be expected to report. What's going to happen is the pilot projects are due to report back to Congress in August 2017. And so I think at that point is when we'll start to understand what the timing of implementation for recipients will be expected to be. So not before August of 2017, and my guess would be they'll give, certainly some kind of a time period for people to get things in place. Right now, I would guess it will be 2018, but again, it's undetermined at this particular point in time until they get all of the federal agencies standardized and doing their part, and that really is the first phase of this project.
I believe there are some relatively aggressive timetables set out in this legislation, and I think folks are going to do the best they can, but I agree with you, Sherry. I think it's going to take a little longer than folks anticipated when they first got into this. So let's try another question. For the transaction tagging that you mentioned, Sherry, what are the typical programming objects or languages used?
Well, I think, programming languages, it's not so much an issue of programming languages, it's an issue of system design. And the real fundamental change of system design for tagging versus what was traditional is the logic no longer goes into the account code structure. And so you have these data elements, which are tags at a transactional level, and those data elements can be anything. So they can be a project number, they could be a grant award ID, they could be a location of performance. And the critical difference in that is that they're carried at the transactional level. They are flexible. You can constantly add or change tags without having impact on what was done prior. It makes the data very traceable from summary level to detailed level. So it's not so much a question of programming language, it's a question of system design. The tools that use those most effectively today, and especially allow the bridge between, an older system, for instance, and sort of this new tagging kind of concept, those really are what are called the XBRL tools. And there are a number of companies that provide those XBRL tools. So if you look up extensible business reporting language or XBRL tools, there are a number of companies that provide those. So it's more an issue of design than it is of code. I hope that answered the question.
Okay. Well, when we're talking about XBRL, you mentioned that public companies are required to file their reports using XBRL with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I believe, in fact, I know that there is a taxonomy that was developed specifically for that reporting. Questions have been raised as to whether or not there needs to be a government-wide taxonomy, meaning all governments across various levels of governments, so that there is common definitions and standard reporting elements. Do you have any thoughts on whether or not, and I know you said that the federal folks are working on or considering XBRL as a reporting mechanism. Do you know if they're considering development of a government taxonomy?
Well, not to the extent that I think you're talking, which is really industry-wide, all governments. They are, through this act, developing a specific taxonomy, and they actually have published the first version of the data schema. So for those that are on our call today that are IT professionals, you can go to the website and find the technical data schema out there. So that's really their first effort, is to get it defined at the federal level. Then we'll see how it flows from there. But no, I'm not aware of anything industry-wide, to your point, Bob.
Okay. We have a related question. What are some examples of tags that might be applied to data fields?
Oh, well, tags can, let me see if I can think of some from the federal. So I said they have period of performance, place of performance. They have a lot of new elements around those two things. So those are both examples of data tags that might be added to a grant transaction that would then allow you to have all the data that you need at the transactional level. So this concept of tags, I think it can really be anything. It can be a physical location. It can be an asset. It can be an account. It can be a project. So that's why this concept is so powerful, because it is so flexible, and because it's carried at the transaction level. It's ultimately auditable and traceable, back to the original source of the data. So really think of tags as something that can be anything that describes a business event, would be a way I would put it. So it's no longer just about an accounting transaction. It's about a business event. And anything you need to describe that business event can be a tag.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. We'll take another one. What are the differences between reporting that will be required under the 2014 Act and the current SEFA reporting model? I don't know the answer to that myself.
Well, I think it's still a little unsure because they haven't finished all of the requirements of the Data Act. What they've done right now is these 57 standard elements that the federal agencies are going to have to adhere to. What they haven't gotten to yet are all of these other data elements, which are at least 112, which are the ones that I was referring to, that you can see on the website of HHS under their CEDAR library. So the question is, will all 112 of those still be required? How are they going to standardize those? What will the changes be? They aren't there yet. So it's a question we can't answer at this particular point, but it's another important reason to stay in touch with what's going on with that pilot project at HHS.
Okay, thank you. Couple questions, and I'll summarize, I guess, related to cost. Are there any estimates of the cost of implementation of the new requirements?
Oh, very good question. I haven't heard from any of our customers yet that they've delved into this enough to have an individual sort of customer estimate of what it might cost them. I do know the last estimate of what it's going to cost the federal government that was reported to Congress was about $150 million. And so there is a congressional effort at this moment to understand more about what those costs are, where they're coming from. But obviously a lot of those are agencies saying we don't have the IT structure to do this, and we need to invest more in information technology. So 150 million at the federal level at this point, and another reason we advise people to get started now thinking about their strategy, because it's depending on what kind of systems you have, like we talked a little bit earlier, could be a fairly significant cost for some and maybe not so much for others.
Right. And my understanding is that to date there has been minimal funding support in terms of incremental appropriations for implementing this act. And of course, we all know there are competing priorities across governments at all levels. So I have heard some folks referring to this already as another unfunded mandate. That may be premature, but for our listeners, that's something that I guess you can think about yourselves and figure out where the funding is going to come from to be able to address these issues. And if you have the opportunity to influence congressional funding, maybe something you want to think about also.
Absolutely. There's still time to influence, so send those calls and letters.
Right. I think we have covered the majority of the questions that we've taken so far. We are getting relatively close to the end of our time, and I want to be respectful of our commitment. So perhaps we'll wrap it up here. In closing, I would like to just thank everyone for joining us for today's event. A big thank you needs to go to my fellow speaker, Sherry Amos, for the great job that she's done, and a special thanks to our partners at Workday for enabling us to bring this worthwhile discussion to our audience. Thanks once again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another governing event. That concludes
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.